Two men are standing on a plank bridge over a small river looking down at the water. One of them points and says, "See how the minnows are darting about? That is the pleasure of fishes." And the other one, and this is the part that matters, does not agree with him. He says, and I am quoting the second half of his sentence exactly as it is printed, "How can you possibly know in what consists the pleasure of fishes? You are not a fish, so how would you know?" The reply comes straight back, "And you not being I." And then the trap. "How can you know that I do not know?" What follows is 3 more exchanges of pure logic chopping, each man trying to close the other down until the first one finally says, "Let us go back to your original question." The book is the Zhuangzi. It is the second great text of Taoism. It is about 100,000 words in the translation I am reading, and in English, it lives on a particular shelf, the one labeled Eastern Mysticism, where the books are supposed to be serene, solitary, and above argument. But look at what I just described. 2 men on a bridge, needling each other about fish. Nobody is being serene. Somebody is being contradicted. Today, in 20 minutes, I'm reading the Zhuangzi in Herbert Giles's translation. And the thing I want to show you is not a philosophy, but a structure. Nearly every passage anyone quotes from this book is one half of an argument, and the man on the other side of it dies before the book ends. The man who said, "You are not a fish," has a name. He is called Hui Tzu, and he was a real person, a logician, a minister of state, and by every indication, an actual friend. I counted him. The string that spells his name appears 49 times in this book. That is not a walk-on part. And once you notice him, you cannot stop noticing him, because he is standing inside almost every famous scene, doing the same job each time, objecting. He is given enormous gourds and complains they are useless. He tells the author that his ideas are as worthless as an ugly tree. He turns up at a funeral to say that the widower is behaving disgracefully. He is, in the most precise sense, the straight man. Now here is why this is worth 20 minutes of your time rather than a footnote. When you meet these passages in English, they usually arrive alone. The reply survives and the objection is dropped, because the reply sounds like wisdom and the objection sounds like an interruption. But the reply was an answer. Remove the question and you are left with a man announcing things to nobody, which is exactly the picture of this book that most people carry around. What does it change? To know that the serene line you have on a card somewhere was said to somebody's face, in an argument, by a man who was losing patience. I would say it changes almost everything about the tone. There is a second thing the counting turns up, and it cuts against an easy reading of this book. Confucius appears more than 200 times. Lao Tzu appears more than 100. This is supposedly the great anti-Confucian text, and the rival sage walks through it constantly, sometimes as a fool, sometimes corrected by a woodcutter, and quite often saying something the author plainly agrees with. A book that was really arguing against a school would not keep handing that school's founder the good lines. What it is doing instead is using people. It thinks in characters, the way a playwright does, and it will borrow anybody's mouth to get a scene moving, which is exactly why the man who shows up 49 times to disagree is not decoration. Hui Tzu is given a seed by a prince, plants it, and grows a gourd the size of a barrel. Then he destroys it. His explanation is a small masterpiece of practical complaint. Filled with liquid, it would be too heavy to lift, and cut in half for ladles, the ladles would be the wrong shape for anything. So, he says, "It was uselessly large, so I broke it up." The reply is not mystical at all. It begins by handing the complaint straight back. "It was rather you who did not know how to use large things," and then it turns into a story about a business deal. There was a family, the author says, who had a recipe for a salve that stopped hands cracking in cold water, and they had used it for generations to go on washing silk through the winter. A stranger heard about the recipe and offered them 100 ounces of silver for it. The family talked it over and took the money, because in a lifetime of washing silk, they had never made anything like that sum. The stranger took the recipe to a king who was about to fight a war on the water in the cold, kept his sailors' hands working when the enemy's hands were splitting open, won, and was given a fief. Same salve. One family stayed in the water. One man ended up with land. So the point is not that the gourd was too big. The point is that Hui Tzu could only imagine 2 uses for a container. And when the object failed both tests, he took a hammer to it. I find this uncomfortably close to how I evaluate most new things. Does it do the job I already have? No? Then it is uselessly large. How many gourds have you smashed this year? There is one famous passage with no argument in it at all, and it is worth putting next to the others to see the difference. A cook is cutting up an ox in front of a prince. Giles gives the sound of it, and the sound is the whole point. Every blow of his hand, every heave of his shoulders, every tread of his foot, every thrust of his knee, and then the noise of the flesh and the chopper, written down as 2 invented words, all of it in rhythm, like a piece of court music. The prince says, "Your skill is extraordinary," and the cook corrects him. "It is not skill," he says. He explains that when he began, he saw nothing but whole oxen. After 3 years, he no longer saw whole oxen, and now he works with his mind rather than his eye, following the natural openings, sliding through the cavities, never touching a ligament or tendon, much less a main joint. A good cook, he says, changes his chopper once a year because he cuts. An ordinary cook changes it once a month because he hacks. His own chopper has been in use for 19 years and has cut up several thousand oxen, and its edge is as if fresh from the whetstone. Notice what kind of claim that is. It is not spiritual. It is a maintenance record. The blade lasts because of where it goes, and where it goes is decided by what he stopped seeing. And notice, too, that nobody objects. When the author wants to show you mastery rather than argue about it, he takes Hui Tzu out of the room. 2 officials come to find him with a job offer. The prince of a large state wants him to run the administration. He is fishing at the time and he does not put the rod down. His answer is a question about a dead animal. He asks them whether it is true that in their state there is a sacred tortoise, dead for thousands of years, whose shell the prince keeps wrapped up in a chest on the altar of the ancestral temple. They say yes. He asks, would that tortoise rather be dead and have its remains venerated, or be alive and wagging its tail in the mud? They answer correctly that it would rather be alive, and then he tells them to leave in a single word and adds, I too will wag my tail in the mud. I want to point out how that refusal is built because it is characteristic. He does not say power corrupts or that he prefers simplicity. He makes the 2 officials answer a question about a tortoise, and by the time they have answered it, they have argued his case for him. It is also, and I think this matters, funny. The dignity of the offer, the fishing rod, the shell in the box, the mud. Someone constructed that scene to get a laugh. When a book is filed under mysticism, the jokes are the first thing to go. They read as noise around the wisdom, so translators and anthologists quietly turn the volume down. But if you take the jokes out of this one, you are not left with a purer version of it. You are left with a different book that says roughly the opposite about how to live. His wife dies. Hui Tzu goes to the house to offer condolences, and he finds the widower sitting on the ground, singing, with his legs spread out at a right angle, beating time on a bowl. Hui Tzu is appalled and says so at length. To live with your wife, he says, and see your eldest son grow up to be a man, and then not shed a tear over her corpse, that would be bad enough. But to drum on a bowl and sing, surely this is going too far. The reply begins by conceding the point. Not at all, he says. When she died, he could not help being affected by her death. Then he describes what changed his mind, and it is a chain of reasoning rather than a consolation. He thought back past her life to a time before she had a body, before she had a spirit, to something formless in the great confusion of things. And then a change came, and she had a spirit, and a change, and she had a body, and a change, and she was born, and now a change has come, and she is dead, and the whole sequence is like the passing of the 4 seasons. She is lying, he says, in the great chamber of the universe. To break in on her rest with the noise of grief would be to show that he had understood none of it. So he stopped. I am not going to tell you that I find this convincing. Reading it, my sympathies are with Hui Tzu, who came to the house expecting a funeral and found a man with a bowl. But I notice something about the shape of the passage. The objection is given real weight, and it is given the human position. The book lets him say it. So let me put my own objection down, since this book seems to invite them. The consolation offered in that scene works by zooming out until the death is a change of season, and at that distance, nothing that happens to any particular person is a loss. That move is available to anyone at any time, and it is almost always used by the person who is not at that moment the one grieving. There is a version of this attitude that is genuinely liberating and a version that is simply cold, and the text does not always seem to me to know which one it is doing. But I want to be careful about the century I am standing in while I say that. This is a book written in a period of constant war between states by someone who watched the machinery of government consume the people who worked inside it, and who turned down a job running one of them. Detachment, for him, was not a lifestyle preference. It was closer to a survival technique, a way of not being destroyed by things he had no power over, in a world that offered him almost no power at all. When a modern reader borrows that same detachment to avoid an inconvenience, the words are identical and the situation is not. Does that make the philosophy wrong? I do not think so. I think it makes it a tool with a very specific handle, and most of us are picking it up by the blade. And notice that the book itself supplies the counter-argument in the person of the friend. Hui Tzu is not written as a fool in that scene. He is written as the one who came. He walked to the house. He expected to sit with someone in the worst week of their life. And what he objected to was not the metaphysics, it was the drumming. A book that wanted you to simply adopt its detachment would not have given the other side the more recognizably decent instinct. He falls asleep and dreams he is a butterfly. The line is better in Giles than in most versions because he keeps the fluttering. Dreamt I was a butterfly, fluttering hither and thither, conscious only of following his fancies as a butterfly and unconscious of being a man at all. Then he wakes up, and he is himself again, and he cannot settle the obvious question. Was he a man dreaming he was a butterfly, or is he now a butterfly dreaming he is a man? This is the most quoted passage in the book and usually the most abused, because it gets recruited into arguments about simulated reality that it has nothing to do with. Read it in place, and it is doing something narrower and better. It is an example offered at the end of a long chapter arguing that the distinctions we make are less stable than we think. The same chapter gives you a shadow and its own faint outer shadow having a conversation, in which the fainter one asks the darker one, "Why this instability of purpose?" and is told that it depends upon something which causes me to do as I do, and that something depends in turn on something else. And then there is the frog. A river god who has always believed himself magnificent reaches the sea and understands his own size for the first time. The ocean explains why the two of them can now have a conversation at all. You cannot speak of ocean to a well frog, the creature of a narrower sphere. You cannot speak of ice to a summer insect, the creature of a season. The insect will not live to see winter, so the word means nothing to it. Who have you written off as a well frog this year? And whose well are you sitting in without having noticed the walls? Hui Tzu comes back with his best complaint, and it is aimed at the author personally. He describes a tree with a trunk so gnarled and knotted that no carpenter would look at it twice, and branches so crooked that you could not cut a straight plank out of the whole thing. Your words, he says, are like that tree, big and no use to anybody. The reply is that the tree has outlived every straight tree in the district, because the straight ones were felled for timber the moment they were tall enough. Its uselessness is why it is still standing. Plant it, he says, in a wide, empty space and lie down to sleep in its shade. There is a whole family of these in the book. A hunchback who is passed over by the army recruiters, a sacred oak that a carpenter walks past without a glance. Every one of them is the same argument. The thing that makes you unusable for somebody else's purposes is the thing that lets you go on existing. which is, I notice, a much more comfortable idea to receive than to act on. It is a good sentence for someone who has already been passed over. It is a very hard sentence for someone who is deciding right now whether to make themselves useful. And this is close to the last time Hui Tzu speaks in the book. I said at the start that the man on the other side of the argument dies before the book ends. And this is where I have to make good on it. After the tree, Hui Tzu stops arriving. There is no death scene, no announcement. He simply stops turning up to object, and the passages after that point change in kind. More instruction and less exchange, more of the author talking and less of anyone talking back. You can feel the room change. I do not want to overstate this. The book is a compilation, assembled over a long time by more than one hand, and the order of the chapters is not a life story. Anyone who tells you that Zhuangzi is a biography is selling you something. But the passages themselves know the difference between speaking to someone and simply speaking. And there is a test you can run on that, which is to read the late chapters and ask who the sentences are aimed at. In the dialogues, the author is always adjusting, conceding a point, taking a question apart, reaching for a story because the direct answer has already failed. In the later material, he explains. The prose is calmer and considerably less alive. I do not think that is a decline in ability. I think it is what happens to anybody's thinking when the person who used to catch their mistakes is no longer in the room. You can hear the same difference in your own work. Something written to convince one specific skeptic has a shape that something written to nobody in particular never has. It anticipates, it hedges in the right places, it drops the parts that would not survive them. Who is the person who catches your mistakes? And what would your work sound like a year after they stopped reading it? And then, near the end, walking past a grave on the way to a funeral, he turns to the people with him and tells one last story. There was a man in the capital of Ying, he says, who got a speck of plaster on the end of his nose, no thicker than a fly's wing, and sent for a stonemason to take it off. The stonemason came with his adze and swung it, and the man sat still. He sat completely still while a heavy blade came down onto his own face, and when it was over, the plaster was gone and the nose was not even scratched, and the man of Ying had never moved a muscle. Later, the Prince of Sung heard about this, sent for the stonemason, and asked him to do it again, on him. And the stonemason said no. He said he had been able to do it once, and then he explained why he could not do it now. But my material has long since perished. His material. Not his skill, not his nerve, not his eye, the other man. The trick was never one person being brilliant, it was two people, and one of them had to be able to sit absolutely still while the blade came down. And that man was dead. And then the author says the thing the whole book has been building towards without telling you. And I too, ever since he perished, have been without my material, having no one with whom I can speak. Every joke in this book needed a straight man. Every one of those famous, serene replies needed somebody standing there being wrong first, on purpose, the way a friend is wrong on purpose. So when you next meet one of these lines on its own, the fish, the butterfly, the useless tree, remember that there is a missing half, and that the missing half was a person. The book does not end by telling you how to live. It ends with a man at a grave, explaining that he has run out of people to argue with,